At my husband's birthday party, his daughter raised her glass and announced they sold his mother's $50,000 ring because she won't remember anyway. Everyone laughed. I smiled, slipped something into her champagne, and 20 minutes later, the screaming started. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Let me tell you about Margaret. She's my husband's mother, and at 68 years old, she's one of those women who make you believe in the goodness of humanity. The kind of woman who still writes thank you notes by hand, who remembers not just your birthday, but your favorite cake flavor, who asks about your day and actually listens to the answer. Margaret wasn't born into money. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. But she had dreams, big ones. She wanted to be a nurse to help people, to make a difference. And she did it. She put herself through nursing school while working nights at a diner, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and determination. Then she met Thomas, David's father. He was a construction worker with kind eyes and rough hands who treated her like she hung the moon. They married young, had 3 children before Margaret turned 30, and built a modest but happy life together. Thomas worked long hours on construction sites. Margaret worked double shifts at the hospital, pulling weekend rotations and holiday coverage so they could afford to send their kids to good schools. When David was 12, Thomas died. A workplace accident that happened in seconds and shattered their world forever. Margaret was 36 years old, suddenly a widow with 3 children to raise alone. No life insurance, no savings, just her nursing salary and a broken heart. But she didn't break. She worked more hours. She took on extra shifts. She learned to fix the leaky faucets and mow the lawn herself. She attended every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play, even when exhaustion made her bones ache. She sacrificed everything: new clothes for herself, vacations, hobbies, any chance at romance, so her children could have opportunities she never had. All 3 kids went to college. David became an accountant. His sister became a teacher. His brother went into sales. Margaret paid for it all, draining her savings, taking out loans she's probably still paying off. She gave them everything. The only thing she kept from that life with Thomas was her ring. It wasn't just any ring. It was a vintage sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, an heirloom that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother. He'd proposed with it on a rainy Tuesday evening in their tiny apartment, getting down on one knee between their secondhand couch and a coffee table he'd built himself. Margaret told me that story at least 50 times, her eyes lighting up every single time like it happened yesterday instead of 45 years ago. 2 years ago, Margaret started forgetting things. Little things at first, where she put her keys, what she ate for breakfast, then bigger things, names, dates. Sometimes she'd forget she'd already told you a story and tell it again. The diagnosis came 6 months later, early-stage dementia. David suggested she move in with us. I agreed immediately. How could I not? This woman who'd given everything deserved to be cared for with dignity and love in her final years. She moved into our spare bedroom with her photos, her memories, and that precious sapphire ring she wore every single day. That ring represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd loved. It was her connection to Thomas, to a time when her mind was sharp and her future was bright with possibility. And my husband and his daughter sold it like it was nothing. Life in our house had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6, make coffee, and find Margaret already sitting in her favorite chair by the living room window. She loved that spot. The morning light would stream through the gauze curtains, and she'd watch the birds gather at the feeder David had installed for her last spring. "Good morning, sweetheart," she'd say when I brought her coffee. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, exactly how she liked it. On her good days, she'd tell me which birds she'd seen: cardinals, blue jays, sparrows. On her difficult days, she'd just smile and hold the warm mug between her palms, content in the quiet. I'd leave for work at 7:30. I taught 5th grade at Riverside Elementary, 20 minutes from our house. Margaret would wave from her window as I pulled out of the driveway, a small ritual that always made me smile. David worked from home most days as an accountant, and he'd assured me he could keep an eye on his mother while I was gone. When I'd come home around 4, I'd usually find them together. Sometimes David would be reading the newspaper aloud to Margaret in the living room. Other times they'd be watching old game shows she loved, David patiently explaining the rules when she got confused. He'd help her to the bathroom when she needed it, never showing frustration or impatience. He'd cut her food into smaller pieces at dinner and wipe her mouth when she forgot. "You're so good with her," I'd tell him, and he'd kiss my forehead and say, "She's my mom." Of course I am. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Evenings were my favorite time. I'd cook dinner while Margaret sat at the kitchen table, sometimes helping me peel vegetables or snap green beans. She'd hum old songs from the 50s, melodies I didn't know but found comforting anyway. We'd eat together as a family, David, Margaret, and me. Simple meals, roasted chicken, meatloaf, spaghetti. Margaret always complimented my cooking, even though half the recipes were ones she'd taught me. After dinner, I'd help Margaret get ready for bed. I'd brush her silver hair, counting the strokes the way my grandmother used to do for me. She'd look at her reflection in the mirror, touching the sapphire ring on her finger with reverence. "Thomas gave me this," she'd say. Sometimes she'd tell the whole proposal story. Other times, just those 6 words were enough. I'd nod and smile, never interrupting, never rushing her. Amanda would visit maybe twice a month, usually on weekends. She'd breeze in with her expensive handbags and designer sunglasses, kiss her father's cheek, and say a cheerful, "Hi, Grandma," to Margaret. She'd stay for an hour or two, scrolling through her phone while half listening to Margaret's stories, then leave with promises to visit again soon. I thought it was normal. A busy young woman making time for family when she could. I thought David's attentiveness to his mother was love. I thought Amanda's casual interest was just generational difference. Everything seemed fine. Our home felt peaceful. Margaret was safe, surrounded by family who cared about her. I'd go to sleep at night feeling grateful that we could give her this: a warm home, good food, dignity in her declining years. I had no idea I was living with thieves who were just waiting for the right moment to strike. I had no idea the man sleeping beside me was already plotting how to rob his own mother blind. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. I came home from work earlier than usual. Teacher in service had been canceled, and walked into a scene that made my stomach clench with immediate concern. Margaret was in her bedroom, pulling drawers open and slamming them shut, her movements frantic and jerky. She'd emptied her jewelry box onto the bed, costume pieces scattered across the floral comforter. Her hands trembled as she rifled through her nightstand drawer, pushing aside pill bottles and reading glasses. "Margaret?" I dropped my bag and rushed to her side. "What's wrong? What are you looking for?" She looked up at me, and the panic in her eyes made my heart break. "My ring," she said, her voice high and desperate. "I can't find my ring. It was here. It was right here on my finger this morning, and now it's gone." I glanced at her left hand. The ring finger was bare, a slight indentation where the band usually sat. She'd worn that ring every single day for 2 years. She never took it off, not even to shower. "Okay, it's okay," I said, keeping my voice calm even though alarm bells were already ringing in my head. "Let's look together. Maybe you took it off to wash your hands." We searched everywhere, under the bed, in the bathroom, between the couch cushions. I checked the kitchen sink, the laundry room, every surface she might have set it down on. Margaret followed me from room to room, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas gave me that ring," she kept saying. "I can't lose it. I can't. It's all I have left of him." "We'll find it," I promised, though doubt was already creeping into my mind. Where could it be? When David came upstairs from his office around 5, I pulled him aside. "Your mother's ring is missing. We've been searching for 2 hours and can't find it anywhere." His response was so casual it felt wrong. He barely looked up from his phone. "Mom probably put it somewhere safe and forgot where. You know how she is." That phrase, "you know how she is." Something about the way he said it, dismissive, almost condescending, made my skin prickle. "David, she's devastated. That ring means everything to her." He shrugged. "We'll keep looking. I'm sure it'll turn up. She probably hid it during one of her confused spells and doesn't remember." I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him, but the unease wouldn't go away. Then, 3 days later, I saw something that made that unease turn into genuine suspicion. I'd come home during my lunch break to grab papers I'd forgotten. As I walked down the hallway, I saw Amanda coming out of Margaret's bedroom. She closed the door so quietly, so carefully, like she didn't want anyone to hear. When she turned and saw me standing there, she actually jumped. Her hand flew to her chest. "Jesus, you scared me," she said with a nervous laugh. "What were you doing in Margaret's room?" I tried to keep my tone light, curious rather than accusatory. "Just checking on Grandma," she said quickly, too quickly. "Making sure she's comfortable. She was napping, so I didn't want to disturb her." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then she brushed past me and practically ran down the stairs. I stood there in the hallway, my heart beating faster than it should. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I just didn't want to believe it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me. My mind kept replaying that moment in the hallway. Amanda's startled face, her nervous laugh, the way she'd practically fled from Margaret's bedroom. I was being paranoid. I had to be. Amanda was David's daughter from his first marriage. She was 26 years old, living in a downtown apartment, working in marketing for some tech startup. She was young and self-absorbed, sure, always on her phone and rarely asking about anyone but herself. But that didn't make her a thief. That didn't make her cruel. And David, the man sleeping next to me, who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who brought me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, who'd promised to love me through better or worse. He adored his mother. I'd seen it with my own eyes. The patience, the care, the gentle way he'd help her remember things when her mind got foggy. I was the outsider here, the second wife. I'd only been part of this family for 3 years. Who was I to suspect them of something so horrible? Margaret had dementia. The doctors had warned us this would happen. Confusion, misplacing things, paranoia sometimes. Maybe she really had hidden the ring somewhere during a confused moment. Maybe it would turn up in a coat pocket or a drawer we hadn't checked yet. The next morning, Margaret asked about her ring again at breakfast. "Have you seen it?" she asked me, her eyes filled with that same desperate hope. Before I could answer, David jumped in. "Mom, we talked about this yesterday. You probably put it somewhere and forgot. These things happen. Try not to worry about it." His tone was patient, understanding, the tone of a devoted son dealing with his mother's declining mind. "See?" I told myself. "He cares. He's handling this well." But then why did my stomach still feel tight? Why couldn't I shake the image of Amanda sneaking out of that bedroom? Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed other small things that I immediately talked myself out of. David would take phone calls in his car instead of inside the house. Normal, right? He worked with clients who valued privacy. Amanda started visiting more often, but she'd spend most of her time with David in his office with the door closed. Family business, I reasoned. Maybe they were planning something nice for Margaret's upcoming birthday. I heard David whisper into his phone one night, "Just be patient. Everything's going according to plan." When I asked who he was talking to, he said it was about a client's tax strategy. I nodded and went back to grading papers. One evening, I found Margaret crying softly in her chair by the window. "I keep dreaming about Thomas," she said. "I want to wear his ring, but I can't remember where it is." The pain in her voice cut through me like glass. I held her hand and promised we'd find it, even though doubt was growing like a cancer in my chest. I wanted so badly to believe in this family. I'd lost my first marriage to infidelity and had been so careful the second time around. David had seemed perfect, stable, kind, family-oriented. I'd built my life around this marriage, this home, this family. Admitting that something was wrong meant admitting I might have made a terrible mistake. It meant facing the possibility that the people I'd trusted were not who they claimed to be. So I kept quiet. I pushed down the suspicions. I smiled and cooked dinner and pretended everything was fine. I chose denial because the truth was too terrifying to face. Not yet. Not yet. It happened on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the ring disappeared. I was making dinner, chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, when David's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower upstairs, and I was alone with the sound of that notification echoing in the quiet kitchen. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't. But as I reached for the cutting board, my elbow knocked his phone off the counter. It clattered onto the tile floor, and when I bent to pick it up, the screen lit up with a text message notification. From Amanda. My hand froze halfway to the phone. I shouldn't read it. That was a violation of privacy, of trust. But something in my gut, that same instinct that had been whispering warnings for weeks, made me pick it up. The message preview was right there on the lock screen. I didn't even have to unlock the phone to read it. Dad, the buyer confirmed $50,000 for Grandma's ring. You were right. She'll never know it's gone. See you at your birthday party to celebrate. We did it. The words blurred. My hand started shaking so violently, I almost dropped the phone again. I read it again and again. Each time, the meaning stayed the same, the betrayal just as sharp, just as brutal. They sold Margaret's ring. They stole it from her. From a woman losing her memory, a woman who trusted them completely. They took the only thing she had left of her dead husband, sold it for $50,000, and celebrated the theft like it was some kind of victory. My breath came in short, painful gasps. The kitchen tilted around me. I grabbed the counter to steady myself, still holding David's phone in my other hand. She'll never know it's gone. That phrase carved itself into my brain. They hadn't just stolen from Margaret. They'd exploited her dementia, weaponized her confusion, banked on her inability to remember or fight back. I heard the shower turn off upstairs. Panic shot through me. My hands were still trembling as I placed the phone back on the counter, exactly where it had been. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to arrange my face into something normal. The vegetables I'd been chopping sat abandoned on the cutting board. I picked up the knife again, but my hands shook so badly I had to set it down. David's footsteps sounded on the stairs. I turned to the sink, splashing cold water on my face, pretending I was just washing my hands. When he walked into the kitchen, smelling like soap and aftershave, I didn't turn around. "Something smells good," he said, coming up behind me and kissing my cheek. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab his phone and shove that message in his face. I wanted to run to Margaret and tell her everything, to call the police, to burn this entire facade of normalcy to the ground. Instead, I smiled. "Just stir fry. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. Great. I'm starving." He grabbed his phone from the counter, checked it, and I watched his expression carefully. Did he know I'd seen it? But his face showed nothing. He just scrolled through his messages, deleted Amanda's text with a casual swipe, and walked into the living room. I stood at that stove, mechanically stirring vegetables in a pan, and felt something inside me crack open. The truth was here now, undeniable and devastating. My husband was a thief. His daughter was his accomplice. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, who'd welcomed me into her family with open arms, was their victim. I couldn't pretend anymore. David's 52nd birthday party was held at our house on a Saturday evening in early May. I'd spent the entire day decorating, cooking, playing. The role of the perfect wife. Streamers hung from the ceiling. A 3-layer chocolate cake sat on the dining room table. 50 guests filled our home. David's co-workers, his siblings, neighbors, college friends I'd met only once or twice. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling when people spoke to me, refilling drinks, making sure everyone had enough food. Inside, I was numb. The evidence of David's betrayal had been burning a hole in my mind for 2 weeks. I'd taken screenshots of that text before he deleted it. I'd been watching, waiting, trying to figure out what to do next. Margaret sat in the corner of the living room, wearing a pale blue dress I'd helped her pick out. She looked small and confused, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. Every few minutes she'd touch her ring finger, that unconscious gesture of someone reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. David held court in the center of the room, laughing loudly, accepting birthday wishes and handshakes. He looked so happy, so proud, so completely unburdened by guilt. How did he do it? How did he look at his mother sitting there in her confusion and feel nothing? Around 8 o'clock, after everyone had eaten and the alcohol had been flowing freely, Amanda stood up. She wore a tight red dress and heels that cost more than my monthly salary. Her champagne glass caught the light as she raised it high, commanding attention. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out, her voice slightly slurred. "I want to make a toast." The room quieted. People turned toward her with indulgent smiles, expecting a sentimental daughter's tribute to her father. What came out of her mouth instead made my blood run cold. "Dad," she said, grinning at David, "this year you finally got smart about Grandma's finances." She giggled, swaying slightly in her heels. "We sold her ring for $50,000. Can you believe it? 50 grand. A few people gasped. Others looked confused. But then Amanda kept going, her words tumbling out without filter or shame. "I mean, let's be real. She won't remember anyway, right? What's the point of letting a valuable heirloom just sit on the finger of someone who doesn't even know what day it is?" The room erupted in laughter. Actual laughter. David's brother slapped his knee. His coworkers chuckled and nodded like this was brilliant financial planning. Someone shouted, "That's smart thinking." David raised his own glass, his face flushed with pride and champagne. "To making practical decisions," he announced. "Why let assets go to waste when they can actually benefit the family?" More laughter, more clinking glasses, more people celebrating the theft and humiliation of a vulnerable woman. I looked at Margaret. She was watching the scene with that sad, confused smile people wear when they know they're the subject of a joke, but don't understand the punchline. She touched her bare ring finger again, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't just theft. This was public cruelty. This was a room full of people, educated, successful, supposedly decent people, laughing at the exploitation of a woman with dementia. This was my husband, the man I'd vowed to love and trust, celebrating the fact that he'd stolen his dying mother's most precious possession. Not one person in that room defended her. Not one voice rose up to say, "This is wrong." So I decided that voice would be mine. But first, I needed them to think they'd won. I forced my face into a smile, raised my own glass, and began to plan their destruction. After Amanda's toast, the party continued around me like nothing had happened. People moved on to other conversations, other drinks, other jokes. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stood there holding my champagne glass so tightly I thought it might shatter in my hand. I needed to know, I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd done. "I need to use the restroom," I murmured to no one in particular, and slipped away from the noise and the laughter. But I didn't go to the bathroom. I went straight to David's office on the second floor, closing the door quietly behind me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. David kept this office locked usually, but tonight, with the party and the drinking, he'd left it open. Careless. Overconfident. I sat at his desk and opened his laptop. I knew his password. He'd never bothered to hide it from me. Why would he? I was his trusting wife who never questioned anything. The first thing I found were the bank statements, Margaret's bank statements. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the transactions from the past 6 months. Withdrawal, $2,000. Memo, living expenses. Withdrawal, $5,000. Memo, medical equipment. Withdrawal, $3,500. Memo, prescription costs. Over and over, dozens of withdrawals slowly draining Margaret's retirement account. I cross-referenced the dates with my own memory. On the day David supposedly bought medical equipment, I'd been the one taking Margaret to her doctor appointments. There was no medical equipment. On the days marked prescription costs, I'd picked up her medications myself. They cost maybe $200, not thousands. He was stealing from her systematically month after month, disguising it as caregiving expenses. Then I found the legal documents. My hands shook as I opened the PDF files, power of attorney papers dated 7 months ago. David had been appointed Margaret's financial power of attorney, signed when she was already showing significant signs of dementia. Had she even understood what she was signing? Or had he simply put papers in front of his confused mother and guided her hand? But it got worse. So much worse. I found an email thread between David and a lawyer named Richard Connors. The subject line read, "Estate Planning, Margaret Hayes." I clicked it open and felt my world collapse. The emails laid out their entire plan. David had been consulting with this lawyer about how to maximize asset recovery from his mother's care. They discussed selling Margaret's small condo, the home she'd lived in for 30 years, and pocketing the profits. They talked about moving her into state-funded care facilities to avoid private nursing home costs. One email from David made me physically ill. She has roughly $120,000 in retirement savings, plus the condo valued at $250,000, plus various assets including jewelry. If we move quickly before she requires full-time care, we can secure these assets for the family rather than letting nursing homes drain everything. The lawyer responded, "Given her diagnosis and your POA status, this is entirely within your legal rights. I recommend liquidating non-essential assets first." Non-essential assets, like a wedding ring. There were receipts, too. Amanda's designer handbag, $4,000. Charged to Margaret's credit card. A luxury vacation to Cancun for David and Amanda, $8,000. Margaret's money. New furniture for Amanda's apartment, $6,000. All of it stolen from a woman who'd worked double shifts her entire life to give her children everything. They weren't just stealing from Margaret. They were systematically dismantling her entire life savings, planning to strip her of every asset she'd ever worked for, then dump her in the cheapest facility they could find while they spent her money on luxuries. The ring was just the beginning. I made it to the bathroom before the sobs came. I locked the door, sat on the cold tile floor, and pressed my fist against my mouth to keep the sounds from escaping. Downstairs, I could hear the party continuing. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses celebrating a man who was destroying his own mother. My phone was clutched in my hand, filled with photos I'd taken of every document, every email, every bank statement. The evidence of a betrayal so complete, so calculated, it made me physically sick. I thought about Margaret teaching me how to make her famous pot roast last Christmas. She'd stood beside me in the kitchen, her hands guiding mine, showing me exactly how much rosemary to add. "This was Thomas's favorite," she'd said, her eyes distant with memory. "I made it for him every Sunday for 23 years. I thought about the day I'd come home crying after a terrible day at school, when a parent had screamed at me in front of my entire class. Margaret had made me tea, sat with me for 2 hours, and told me stories about difficult patients she'd dealt with as a nurse. "People lash out when they're scared or hurting," she'd said. "It's not about you, sweetheart. You're doing good work." I thought about how she'd welcomed me into this family without hesitation. David's first wife had left him, and his family had been fractured and defensive. But Margaret had hugged me the first time we met. "I'm so glad David found you," she'd whispered. "You have kind eyes. I can always tell." Kind eyes. And I'd stood by and watched while her own son robbed her blind. Fresh tears came, harder this time. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about every elderly person who'd trusted their children to protect them. This was about my own grandmother, who died in a nursing home while her son fought over her estate before she was even gone. This was about a society that treated its elders as disposable, as burdens, as assets to be liquidated, rather than human beings deserving of dignity. Margaret had worked 60-hour weeks as a nurse. She'd held dying patients' hands, wiped away their tears, advocated for them when no one else would. She'd raised 3 children alone after her husband died, sacrificing every dream and desire she'd ever had. She'd put those children through college, attended their graduations, celebrated their successes, and this was her reward: theft, mockery. A son who saw her dementia not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Mascara streaked down my face. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked destroyed, broken, and maybe I was. I'd been so desperate to believe in this family, so determined to make my second marriage work, that I'd ignored every red flag. Amanda sneaking out of Margaret's room. David's dismissive attitude about the missing ring. The whispered phone calls. The closed-door meetings. I'd chosen blindness over truth because truth was too painful, and in my silence, in my desperate need to belong, I'd become complicit. But sitting there on that bathroom floor, surrounded by the sounds of people laughing at an old woman's exploitation, something shifted inside me. The grief began to harden into something else, something sharper, something dangerous. I thought about Margaret sitting downstairs in her blue dress, touching her empty ring finger, confused and sad and utterly alone, in a room full of people who should have protected her. No more. I wiped my face, fixed my makeup, and stood up. My reflection stared back at me, no longer broken but burning with purpose. They thought they'd won. They thought Margaret's dementia made her helpless, and my love for David made me blind. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I stared at my reflection in that bathroom mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same person who'd walked into this house 3 years ago, starry-eyed and hopeful about her second chance at love. That woman had been broken by her first marriage, timid, eager to please, afraid to make waves. But she was gone now. In her place stood someone harder. Someone who'd seen exactly what human beings were capable of when they thought no one was watching. Someone who understood that evil didn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wore a smile and called you sweetheart and kissed you goodnight after stealing from its own mother. I washed my face, reapplied my makeup with steady hands, and smoothed down my dress. When I opened that bathroom door and walked back downstairs, I wasn't the same woman who'd gone up. The party was still in full swing. David stood near the fireplace, arm around his brother's shoulders, both of them laughing at some joke. Amanda was showing off her new handbag to a group of women, explaining how she'd finally saved up for it. The lies came so easily to them, so naturally. I watched them like I was seeing them for the first time. David caught my eye from across the room and smiled, that warm, affectionate smile I'd fallen in love with, the smile that had made me feel safe and cherished. Now I saw it for what it was, a mask, a tool, something he wore to manipulate people into trusting him. I smiled back. If he could play a role, so could I. I moved through the party with renewed purpose, refilling drinks, laughing at jokes, playing the gracious hostess. But my mind was racing, calculating, planning. I had evidence, screenshots, photos, documents. I had knowledge they didn't know I possessed. I had the element of surprise. Most importantly, I had something they'd completely underestimated: the fierce, protective rage of someone who'd finally found their backbone. Margaret sat in her chair, mostly ignored by the crowd. I brought her a glass of water and sat beside her for a moment, taking her hand. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She looked at me with those cloudy eyes and squeezed my fingers. "I miss my ring," she whispered. "Did I tell you Thomas gave it to me?" "You did," I said, my throat tight. And we're going to get it back. I promise you that." She looked confused but smiled anyway, trusting me the way she'd trusted her son, the way she'd trusted everyone, because that's who Margaret was. Someone who believed in the goodness of people. They'd weaponized that goodness. They'd turned her trust into an opportunity for exploitation. I wouldn't let them get away with it. Looking around that room, I realized something crucial. These people, David's friends, his co-workers, his family, they'd all laughed at Margaret's expense because David had made it seem acceptable, even smart. They'd followed his lead, taken his cues. They didn't know about the systematic theft, the forged documents, the planned abandonment. What would happen when they did know? When I held up a mirror and forced them to see what they'd been celebrating? David thought he was untouchable. He had power of attorney. He had legal documents. He had a diagnosis he could point to, a mother whose confusion would make her an unreliable witness. But he didn't have what I had. Irrefutable evidence, moral clarity, and absolutely nothing left to lose. My marriage was already over. I just hadn't told him yet. My place in this family was a lie built on his deception. I had no reason to protect him, no reason to stay silent. I was done being the complicit bystander, done being the trusting fool. Margaret had been everyone's victim for too long. It was time for her to have a champion, and if David and Amanda wanted a war, I'd give them one they'd never forget. The plan came to me in pieces, falling into place like a puzzle I'd been unconsciously assembling. I had maybe 20 minutes before someone noticed I'd been gone too long. 20 minutes to set everything in motion. First, I needed chaos. I needed Amanda incapacitated and David distracted. I needed witnesses who actually cared about Margaret, who would see through the lies and manipulation. I went to the upstairs bathroom, the one guests weren't using, and opened the medicine cabinet. There, behind the everyday items, I found what I was looking for: a bottle of prescription-strength laxatives left over from when David had needed a colonoscopy prep. Strong ones, the kind that worked fast and hit hard. My hands didn't shake as I crushed. 4 tablets into fine powder using the back of a spoon. I felt eerily calm, like I was watching myself from outside my own body. This was wrong, wasn't it? Drugging someone? But then I thought about Margaret's bare finger, about the emails planning to dump her in state care, about Amanda's mocking laughter. I poured the powder into a small envelope from David's office and slipped it into my pocket. Back downstairs, I moved through the party like a ghost on a mission. Amanda was holding court near the champagne table, already tipsy, her voice too loud as she showed off photos on her phone. Probably the Cancun vacation she'd taken with Margaret's money. I picked up a fresh champagne flute, turned my back to the crowd, and emptied the envelope into the glass. The powder dissolved almost instantly in the bubbles. My heart hammered, but my hands were steady. "Amanda," I called out sweetly, walking over with the glass extended. "I got you a fresh one. You look like you need it after that wonderful toast." She took it without hesitation, too drunk and too confident to suspect anything. "Thanks." She downed half of it in one gulp. 20 minutes. That's how long the medication would take to kick in. I checked my watch and started my timer. Next phase. Documentation. I pulled out my phone and casually started recording, holding it low and natural like I was just checking messages. I needed David to confess on camera. I needed him to explain everything in his own words, while he was still riding high on champagne and arrogance. I approached him near the fireplace, where he stood with his brother and 2 coworkers. "Honey," I said, slipping my arm through his and smiling adoringly. "I'm still a little confused about the whole ring situation. Can you explain it to me again? I want to make sure I understand." David, drunk and proud, didn't hesitate. With my phone recording in my pocket, he launched into the whole story. "Well, Mom had this vintage sapphire ring, right? Worth about 50 grand. And with her dementia, she doesn't even remember having it half the time. So I thought, why let it just sit there when we could actually use the money? That's so smart," I said, my voice dripping with false admiration. But how did you get it? Doesn't she wear it all the time? Amanda helped with that, he said, gesturing to his daughter. She visited one day, said she wanted to try it on, and Mom let her. Easy. We had it appraised and sold within a week. His brother laughed. That's brilliant, man, practical thinking. Exactly, David continued, encouraged by the approval. I have power of attorney anyway, so technically it's all legal. Mom's assets are mine to manage, and honestly, this is better for everyone. The money's already in our account. I got every word, every incriminating detail. My phone buzzed. 15 minutes had passed. Right on schedule, I heard a sound from across the room. Amanda clutching her stomach, her face suddenly pale. Oh, God, she moaned. The screaming would start soon, time for the final piece. I excused myself and stepped into the kitchen, pulling up my contacts. Margaret's church friends, the women who'd known her for 40 years, who remembered what she'd sacrificed, who'd been asking to visit for months. I called Barbara, the leader of their prayer group. Barbara, it's me. I need you and the ladies to come to David's birthday party right now. There's something you need to see. Something about Margaret. What's wrong? Her voice sharpened with concern. Just come, please, and hurry. I hung up and walked back into the living room, where Amanda was now doubled over, sweat beading on her forehead. The revenge had begun. Amanda's first trip to the bathroom happened 12 minutes after she'd downed that champagne. She excused herself quickly, her face flushed, one hand pressed against her stomach. When she came back 5 minutes later, she looked shaken, her carefully applied makeup slightly smudged. You okay? Someone asked. Fine, she said tightly. Just something I ate. I smiled and sipped my own drink, watching the clock. The party continued, but I noticed David glancing at his daughter with growing concern. Amanda made another desperate dash to the bathroom 10 minutes later. This time, when she emerged, her designer dress had a visible stain on the back, and tears were streaming down her face. Oh no, someone whispered. Amanda looked mortified, realizing people could see. She tried to cover herself with her hands, but it was too late. The humiliation was painted across her face. Amanda, what? David started. I don't know, she practically screamed. Something's wrong, I can't. She doubled over with a groan, clutching her stomach. Oh God, not again. She ran, and this time we could hear her crying from behind the bathroom door. The party atmosphere shifted. People exchanged uncomfortable glances. The laughter had stopped. Perfect timing. The doorbell rang. I'll get it, I announced brightly, setting down my glass. I opened the door to find 5 elderly women standing on the porch, led by Barbara. She was 73, silver-haired, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. Behind her stood Eleanor, Patricia, Judith, and Rose, Margaret's prayer group, her closest friends from 40 years of church attendance. Where is she? Barbara demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Where's Margaret? Please come in, I said, stepping aside. The women swept into the house like an avenging force of nature. The party guests parted for them instinctively. These weren't frail old ladies you could dismiss or patronize. These were women who'd raised families through poverty and war, who'd buried husbands and children, who'd seen every kind of human behavior and weren't impressed by money or status. They spotted Margaret immediately, still sitting alone in her chair by the window. Margaret! Barbara rushed to her, taking both her hands. The other, women surrounded her protectively, like a living shield. Margaret looked up, confused at first, then her face brightened with recognition. Barbara, what are you doing here? We came to check on you, sweetheart. We've missed you. David approached, his expression wary now. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Can I help you, ladies? Barbara straightened to her full 5'2" height and looked at him with undisguised contempt. We're here for Margaret. Someone called us with concerns. Every eye in the room turned to me. I smiled innocently. Actually, I said, reaching for my phone, since everyone's here, I wanted to show some photos. Birthday memories. I pulled out the TV remote. Let me just connect my phone to the screen. I have some wonderful moments to share. That's really not necessary. David started, his voice tight. Oh, but I insist, I interrupted, my smile never wavering. Everyone needs to see this. Amanda emerged from the bathroom again, pale and trembling, her dress ruined. She looked around at the church ladies, at the silent crowd, at me standing by the TV with my phone in hand, and something like panic flickered across her face. Dad? She said weakly. The room had gone completely quiet. Someone had turned off the music. 50 people stood frozen, watching, waiting, sensing that something significant was about to happen. I connected my phone to the TV screen. The display flickered to life. Before we cut the cake, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, I think everyone should see what we're really celebrating tonight. David's face had gone white. What are you doing? I pressed play. The truth. The video started playing on the 70-inch television screen. David's voice filled the room, loud and clear, recorded just 30 minutes earlier. Well, Mom had this vintage sapphire ring, right? Worth about 50 grand. And with her dementia, she doesn't even remember having it half the time. So I thought, why let it just sit there when we could actually use the money? The room gasped. I watched faces change as people processed what they were hearing. On screen, David continued, Amanda helped with that. She visited one day, said she wanted to try it on, and Mom let her. Easy. We had it appraised and sold within a week. His brother's voice. That's brilliant, man, practical thinking. David again. I have power of attorney anyway, so technically it's all legal. Mom's assets are mine to manage. I paused the video. The silence was deafening. But wait, I said, my voice steady and cold. There's more. I swiped to the next file. Bank statements filled the screen. Margaret's account with withdrawal after withdrawal, highlighted in red. $50,000. $75,000. $90,000. Gone. These are Margaret's bank accounts, I explained to the frozen crowd. David has been systematically draining them for months. Medical expenses that never happened. Equipment that was never purchased. Care that was never provided. Another swipe. The emails appeared, blown up large enough for everyone to read. And here are emails between David and his lawyer, discussing how to liquidate all of Margaret's assets, including selling her home, and then placing her in state-funded care to avoid paying for proper treatment. Barbara's voice cut through the silence like a knife. You were going to dump her in a state facility? I nodded. After stealing everything she worked her entire life to save, the crowd erupted. Not in laughter this time, but in shock and outrage. That's elder abuse. He stole from his own mother? She has dementia, for God's sake. David found his voice, holding up his hands. Now wait, everyone just calm down. This is a family matter. My wife is clearly confused. Confused? I cut him off, my voice sharp. I have screenshots of Amanda's text. I have your recorded confession. I have bank records, legal documents, and evidence of systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Amanda, still clutching her stomach, started crying harder. Dad, make her stop, make her... She doubled over again, groaning. David's co-workers were backing away from him, disgust written on their faces. His brother looked like he'd been slapped. Neighbors were pulling out their phones, some recording, some already texting others. Eleanor stood up, her voice trembling with rage. Margaret worked nights at the hospital to put you through college. She sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay her? You people don't understand, David said desperately. Mom's care is expensive. I was just being practical. Practical? Barbara's voice could have cut glass. You were stealing from a woman with dementia and calling it practical? I took a deep breath, savoring this moment. Actually, David, there's one more thing everyone should know. His eyes met mine, and I saw the fear there. He knew. Somehow, he knew this wasn't over. I didn't just discover this tonight, I said calmly. I found out 2 weeks ago, And the first thing I did was contact Elder Abuse Services, the state attorney's office, and Margaret's original lawyer, the one who handled her affairs before you fraudulently obtained power of attorney. David's face went from white to gray. I sent them everything, every email, every bank statement, every piece of evidence, and they've been building a case. The doorbell rang again. I smiled, and that would be them now. I walked to the door and opened it to reveal 2 police officers and a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. Behind them stood a man I recognized from photos. Gerald Morrison, Margaret's original attorney, the one who'd handled her affairs before David had manipulated her into signing new documents. "Mrs. Hayes," the female officer said, "I'm Officer Chen. We spoke on the phone." "Please come in," I said, stepping aside. The party guests scattered like roaches when lights turn on. Some grabbed their coats and fled immediately. Others stood frozen, phones in hand, recording everything. David's brother tried to slip out the back door. "Nobody leaves," Officer Chen announced. "We'll need statements from witnesses." David stood in the center of the room, his birthday party transformed into a crime scene. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have power of attorney. I have every legal right." "Power of attorney obtained through fraud," Gerald Morrison interrupted, opening his briefcase and pulling out documents. "I was Margaret's lawyer for 20 years. She came to me 6 months before she signed those papers with you, specifically stating she didn't want her finances changed. She was already showing signs of confusion, and she told me she was worried about being taken advantage of." He held up a notarized document. "This is her original directive stating her wishes clearly. You took her to a different lawyer when she was in an advanced state of dementia and had her sign documents she couldn't possibly understand. That's fraud and exploitation of a vulnerable adult." The woman in the business suit stepped forward. "I'm Sarah Chen from Adult Protective Services. Mr. Hayes, you're under investigation for financial exploitation of an elderly person, forgery, and abuse of power of attorney." Amanda, still pale and sick, started sobbing. "I didn't know it was illegal. Dad said it was fine. He said, 'You texted about stealing the ring.' I said coldly. 'You celebrated it. You knew exactly what you were doing.'" Officer Chen approached David. "Sir, we need you to come to the station for questioning." "I want my lawyer," David said immediately. "That's your right," the officer agreed. "But you should know. Financial exploitation of an elderly person in this state is a felony, and you're looking at up to 10 years in prison and restitution of all stolen funds." The room spun around me, but I kept my expression neutral. This was justice, but it felt surreal watching it unfold. Within 48 hours, David was formally arrested. Amanda was charged as an accessory. The power of attorney was immediately revoked by court order, and Gerald Morrison was appointed as Margaret's temporary guardian. Every penny David had stolen was frozen, pending criminal and civil proceedings. The ring was tracked down to a private collector in New York. When the buyer learned it had been stolen from a woman with dementia, he returned it immediately without asking for his money back. "I don't want any part of this," he'd said. I filed for divorce on Monday morning. The judge granted an emergency order based on the criminal charges, awarding me the house and protecting my assets from David's legal fees. The trial took 6 months. David was convicted on multiple counts of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to repay every dollar he'd stolen plus damages, over $300,000 total. Amanda received 3 years probation and community service. Her marketing career destroyed when her company learned about the charges. Margaret never had to testify. Her doctors provided medical documentation of her condition, and the evidence I'd gathered spoke for itself. Barbara and her church friends arranged a rotating care schedule. Margaret moved into Barbara's home, where she had her own room with a view of the garden. On her good days, she wore her sapphire ring and smiled. I visited every Sunday, bringing flowers and her favorite cookies. One afternoon, about a year after the trial, Margaret held my hand and looked at me with clarity I hadn't seen in months. "You saved me," she said simply. "You deserve to be saved," I replied. Sometimes I think about that night, the birthday party where everything changed. I think about Amanda's champagne glass catching the light, about the laughter that filled the room when she announced they'd sold a dying woman's most precious possession. I think about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to convince myself it wasn't my place to interfere, to preserve my marriage by sacrificing Margaret's dignity. I think about the moment I made my choice, not when I slipped that powder into the champagne. That was just tactics. The real moment was earlier, sitting on that bathroom floor with evidence of betrayal burning in my hands, when I decided that some things matter more than keeping the peace. Some things matter more than protecting yourself from uncomfortable truths. Margaret sits in Barbara's garden now, that sapphire ring back on her finger where it belongs. She doesn't always remember my name anymore. Sometimes she introduces me as her daughter. Sometimes she asks when Thomas is coming home. But on her clear days, she holds my hand and says, "You're the one who fought for me." And I realize that's what love actually looks like. Not the performance David gave, the patient smiles and gentle assistance that masked systematic theft. Real love is fighting for someone when they can't fight for themselves. Real love is uncomfortable and costly and requires you to stand up even when everyone else is sitting down. Here's what that night taught me. Evil doesn't always announce itself with villainous speeches and dark intentions. Sometimes it walks in, wearing a smile, holding a champagne glass, celebrating theft as practical decision-making. Sometimes it's your own family, people you trust, people who've convinced themselves that exploiting vulnerability is justified because the victim won't remember anyway. Dementia doesn't erase a person's humanity. Forgetting doesn't mean someone deserves to be forgotten, or worse, deliberately victimized. Margaret had worked 60-hour weeks saving lives as a nurse. She'd raised 3 children alone. She'd sacrificed every dream and comfort for her family. She had earned dignity, protection, and fierce advocacy in her most vulnerable years. Instead, her sons saw an opportunity. Her granddaughter saw a payday, and a room full of supposedly decent people saw nothing wrong with it, until someone forced them to look. Our elderly deserve better than adult children who view their parents' declining minds as business opportunities. They deserve better than being reduced to assets to be liquidated, problems to be managed, burdens to be minimized. They deserve our protection, our respect, and our willingness to speak up when we see abuse, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us something. So let me ask you something. If you'd been at that party, if you'd heard Amanda's toast and watched everyone laugh, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to avoid confrontation? Would you have convinced yourself it was none of your business? Or would you have spoken up? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one and I want to know, would you have fought for Margaret? If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about justice, courage, and standing up for what's right even when the cost is high. And please, I'm asking you personally, if you know an elderly person in your life, check on them. Not just a quick phone call, but really check. Look at their finances if they'll let you. Ask questions. Be present. Because predators count on silence, on everyone assuming someone else is watching, on families being too polite to interfere. Be the person who refuses to be silent. Be the person who fights back. Be the person Margaret needed, the one who sees injustice and says, "Not on my watch." What would you do? Tell me in the comments. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right.